First of all, I'd like to join the panel in thanking the conference organizers for inviting me here. I also would like to thank the presenters before me, the critical ones, for saying the things that I really agree with you. In the 90s, there's a number of things I also want to say still, but he's gone, so let me just focus on what I have to present. But I have to thank him for stimulating my mind. In the 1960s, the Philippines was actually second to Japan in terms of development. You know, we manufacture the biggest number of industrial goods second to Japan, in the 1960s. But by the late 1990s, the Philippines is already known as the sick man of Asia, and I'm using the word man, advisedly, obviously. And after many years in Southeast Asia, many of our neighbors have surpassed us in terms of development. And why is this so? I'll go to that later. Today, there are 38 million workers in the Philippines. About 3 to 4 million are unemployed, 6 million are underemployed. So you're talking about at least 1/3 of the entire labor force being underutilized. Of those who are lucky to be employed, a huge chunk of these are those found in the informal labor. What used to be typical is actually the typical work in the Philippines. A huge amount of workers are found in the informal sector. And those who are found in the formal sector are working under precarious conditions. You can name all types of precarious works. Agency hired, short-term workers, temporary workers, contractual, probationary, trainees, name it, we have it. And many of our workers are now working under contractual conditions. It's so widespread that it has spawned a new vocabulary even among the youth. Among the youth in my country. Like if you see youngsters, the youth talking among themselves and greeting each other. So how are you? Well, what are you now into? One of them would eventually say, "Oh, right now I'm endo." Endo. So I kept on thinking, what does that mean, endo? And so when I asked my own kid, what does endo mean? He said, "Oh, Dad, you're so passé." Endo means end of contract. So it is seeping into the culture of the youth that working for just 3 months is acceptable. And I'm part of a generation in my country where I saw the situation. I worked before, and I saw a situation before that when you step on your 6th month in your job, you actually celebrate. You actually throw a party because you are automatically a regular employee. Today, that's no longer the case. Endo is the case. So that's a problem. Now, why is that so? This is actually the product of decades of flirtation in market-oriented policies. Neoliberalism, if you like. Capitalism is what I usually use. But and when I say that, I'm not even referring I'm not yet even referring to the trade agreements that we have. I'm merely referring to the massive privatization, deregulation, liberalization that was unilaterally carried out by governments after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship. So in 1980s, while we are all happy celebrating the downfall of the Marcos dictatorship, little did we know that the new government was so busy stitching up new policies that would actually free the entire country, from and attach the entire country to globalization. So what we did a few years back, we did our own studies. And again, let me repeat: I'm not yet referring to the effects of FTAs. I'm just referring to the effects of all the neoliberal policies that we've had. We've actually made the comparative studies in my country, during the period of 1970s and 1980s, where we had this so-called import substitution industrialization, and the period between oh sorry, 1950s to 1970s, and the period between 1980s and 2000. That's a period of export-oriented industrialization. So, and we did a very clear study on this. And what did we find out? One, economic growth was doubly higher during the period of 1950s and 70s, when we don't have privatization, regulation, and liberalization. You know, economic growth simply went down, and in fact, it became even negative for several years during the second phase. Second, even if you look at the for every decade, even if you compare it decade by decade, you know, it's very clear that development is much higher during the period of first phase rather than the export-oriented industrialization. Growth per sector is also completely higher in all the sectors, no? From agriculture, industry, services. So that's very clear in our study. Second, it was clear that when we started moving towards the next phase, export-oriented industrialization, there was clearly deindustrialization. Manufacturing as a generator of jobs weakened so much that today we only have about 15 million. We only have about 15% of our workforce employed in industries. Third, the economy was much more vulnerable to crisis during the first period than the second period. And finally, there was a stark income inequality when we started using neoliberal policies. So this was a study that we've done a few years back. No? But today, what do we have in mind? What do we have? Today, the same policies that we think that we know have destroyed the rights and welfare of workers are now being enshrined in a number of trade policies. That would include the FTAs that we have been discussing. Bear in mind that the policies that I have been discussing were unilaterally implemented by our government. Meaning, if we want to, we can easily, recall these policies. But the problem with putting all these policies now into a trade agreement, into a trade package like Japan, Philippines, EPA, for example, or the EU-ASEAN FTA, for example. The problem with putting it in a trade package is that now we are locking ourselves into that policy. We can no longer, remove it. We can no longer reverse that policy, or it would be so expensive for us, at the very least, to reverse these policies. So that's the one thing that I'd like to add about the dangers of FTAs. It's the lock-in mechanism of a free trade agreement. And that's the reason why I agree that FTAs have nothing to do with trade. They have nothing to do with trade. They have everything to do with profits. They have everything to do with enshrining corporate rights, but nothing with trade.